Testing, testing. Is this? Oh. I think you get the last copy. Can you? Otherwise, I need 15 of them.
Miss Chun? Here. Miss Del Rossi? Here. Miss Doherty?
Here.
Miss Delay?
Here.
Miss Khan? Here. Miss Thompson? Here. Mia Chow? Here. 7 present.
Want to also thank you for being here with the presentation.
I think you have to turn your mic on because they're televising it, right?
Thank you. Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you for being here for this special meeting to do from the Massachusetts Association of School Committees. And tonight is the presentation, and we're going to make it maybe a little bit more less formal and just presentations. And if members have questions as we go, please feel free to, for the sake of saving time, just ask questions directly to the presenter, and then we'll go from there. Thank you. You have the floor.
Is it me? Okay.
Turn your mic on.
I think the mic is on.
Okay.
Always assume the mic is on. So, at this time of year, we visit a lot of school committees across the state, talking to the members about roles and responsibilities and dealing with some of the very interesting issues that occur when the roles and responsibilities are not necessarily as clear as people would like. And there's a lot of ambiguity about this. Now, are there any lawyers in the room? Okay. No, I'm just going to. Well, you will probably appreciate this. There are areas where the law is very clear. The school committee makes policy. The superintendent administers the district day to day. And there are certain authorities that are very clear. The budget is set by approved by the school committee. The rules of the school committee are made by the school committee. Policies related to any one of hundreds of areas of policy made by the school committee. The principals are appointed by the superintendent. The teachers are hired under the authority of the superintendent. Those things are clear. But there are other areas where the administrative responsibility of the superintendent and the policy-making responsibilities of the school committee and those additional legal responsibilities delegated to the school committee create ambiguity. And we have consulted with the Council of School Attorneys, with our own attorney, Steve Finnegan, who some of you may have dealt with over the years, and said, how do we know when something is policy or something is administrative if it's really not clear. And the legal advice we have constantly received is, you have to work it out. Now, that's not a great legal answer, but you have to work it out. We have some general ideas about what defines policy beyond a simple declaration of a policy. For example, something that determines eligibility for a benefit or a service could be policy. Anything having to do with money can be part of your fiduciary responsibility. Certain rights and responsibilities can be policy, but a lot of it is vague. We developed this particular guide to help address some of the most frequently addressed areas where there is disagreement or conflict. And if you see something in red, it's because it's been identified in the last 18 months as something that has been more of, this started out as a small document, and it's now 22 pages long. So I would throw that out there. And what we normally do when we speak to a school committee is to ask, where have you experienced those areas of difficulty? Now, as a school committee, you're the legislature for schools in Lowell. 2 houses of government in Lowell, the city council and the school committee. So that's your legislative branch. In Lowell, you also have the executive branch, which includes the city manager and the mayor, who I come from a planned city myself, so I understand the mayor chairs the city council and the school committee. That's unusual, but Worcester, Cambridge, and Lowell are like that, and that gives you a sort of balance of power. The school committee also has responsibility for making policy, determining and monitoring the budget through your fiduciary responsibilities. And your fiduciary responsibilities are unique in that they're not necessarily purely policy, they're governmental. The people's money is not spent without the approval of the elected representatives of the community. So that's why the budget goes through you and then subsequently goes through the city council before it's finalized. You are also the employer of record for collective bargaining. So the collective bargaining in the district is done in the name of the school committee. And there are districts, I don't know how it works in Lowell, but there are districts where you will have separate legal counsel for educational matters, for collective bargaining, for other legal issues as may come up, and usually there's special counsel for special education as well. So you might have 3 or 4 lawyers that have you as the client. There are occasions when your attorney or the superintendent may not be able to give you all the information you want because they need to protect the privacy of the people involved. So, for example, if your attorney is dealing with a special education case, that's confidential. If your attorney is brought in to deal with a situation of an educator who is being counseled out of the profession or not being renewed or transferred or personnel matter, that can be a confidential matter that remains so. Just some other elements to being an elected official for those of you who haven't been through our orientation. You, as elected officials, and the superintendent are, under Massachusetts law, public figures. Now, let me explain what it means to be a public figure. A public figure means anybody out there in the street can decide to insult you, offend you, write a letter to the editor of the newspaper, and make criticism of you pretty much freely, because that's how broad the freedom of speech is in Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, the state constitution's Bill of Rights is stronger in every respect than the federal constitution. Massachusetts, the right of free speech shall not be abridged. That's very broad. In Massachusetts, your constituents have an unrestricted right to call you and instruct you about how they want you to do their job. So when your constituents are calling you, they're exercising a constitutional right to speak to you. Now, this can create probably our most frequent area of trouble, because any parent out there who's dissatisfied can call a member of the school committee, their elected representative, and say, here's my problem. But you don't have the authority to resolve their problem directly in most cases. If they say, I have a problem, your policy says my child has to be 5 years old by August 31st, and my child is born September 1st, well, you can vote to change that policy, but you can't remove the teacher who may be unsatisfactory. You can't get special privileges for a child because they know you. These things are not consistent with what the law has intended to do. But there's a lot of other stuff where there's great area of ambiguity. Also, you have various tools at your hand that you can call upon if you need, but they don't operate as fast as you might think. For example, the superintendent's evaluation. If this is an example we give frequently, it's got nothing to do with Lowell, but it's something that we talk about. When a constituent comes to you with a problem, usually the most appropriate thing for you to do is to refer them to somebody, the superintendent or the principal, whoever the appropriate person is that you want to go to, but you can refer them directly to the superintendent if you wish, and then the superintendent can send them to a more appropriate place. If they call you over the course of the year and they say, thank you very much, we spoke to the superintendent's office, we were referred to somebody, our problems were addressed, we were treated respectfully, thank you very much. When evaluation time comes, and you evaluate the superintendent on the basis of relationships with the community, you give the superintendent a good remark. If they come back to you, and I've had this happen, and they say, why did you tell us to refer them to the superintendent? The superintendent did not treat us respectfully, did not consider our complaints legitimate, told us that we should listen to the superintendent or the principals and not question them, and we hear this over and over again. Then when evaluation time comes, maybe you want to have a conversation about the superintendent's effective ability to manage subordinates. In other words, the evaluation process is one way that the school committee has a chance to deal with that relationship if they feel the relationship's going well. I do say, and I try to honor this tonight, the staff all knows Glenn's Law number 1, brief is good, and Glenn's Law number 2, don't look for trouble where no trouble exists. So we're not here to try to start anything, but I do want to get from you some sense of where you may be having areas where your roles and responsibilities are ambiguous enough so that you need to try to figure out how to work them out. Hence, some of the more complex questions. And when we do new member orientation, my classic example, and this is sort of a silly one, but it's real. You'd probably appreciate it. Who gives out the diplomas to the high school kids at graduation? The mayor. Okay. Well, we had a situation, well, same way in Cambridge. We had a situation where the new high school principal came to the high school. I'm the principal. This is my building. These are my students. This is my faculty. I'm giving out the diplomas. And in this particular case, the chairman of the school committee said, well, but I've been doing it, and my predecessors have been doing it for 120 years. And the superintendent wisely intervened and said, this may be your building, this is not a battle you want to have, because there's an area of ambiguity, and that is who's the ceremonial head of the city for giving out diplomas. And the school committee's policy was the chair of the school committee. And in Massachusetts, the mayor is usually on the school committee and often the chair, but not always. But in this case, that was the mayor saying to the superintendent, this principal gets away with acting like that? And by the way, I'm getting complaints from parents about my building, my kids, my teachers. This little humility would be helpful. You work that out. I will ask you, areas of ambiguity, areas that may be problematic or have been problematic, please share.
But in terms of the evaluation, some of us had like a shorter evaluation and some of us had like a longer evaluation. So which one is the right evaluation?
Now, superintendent evaluation is very heavily prescripted by the state. We're on TV now, so I will avoid gratuitous editorial assertions about the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and the 800 pages of explanations that go along with evaluation. But I will say this. At the beginning of the evaluation period, the school committee meets or should meet with the superintendent and lay some ground rules down. And those ground rules should include who gets to participate in the evaluation, because if you have a January to January cycle and you just step on the school committee in January, you might not be appropriately asked to evaluate a superintendent who you just met 20 minutes ago. So that's important. You might also want to involve somebody who just stepped off the school committee, but who might want to turn in the form just for the sake of advising you or giving you information. So you decide some important things. Who gets to evaluate? What is the cycle that you're going to use? Some people use July to June because it's the academic year. Some cities use January to January, and some towns are all over the place because in towns the elections are held between February and June, and they're not all the same. All right. Number 3, what are the criteria you will use to evaluate the superintendent? And usually they're based on the superintendent's goals and the superintendent's practice goals. And the superintendent will have goals that are personal, professional goals, school district improvement goals, and student achievement goals. And I want to say one thing about goals. The goals are designed to be what are called SMART goals, S-M-A-R-T. They are specific, measurable, attainable, all right, relevant, and timely. So let me give you a SMART goal for me if I were the superintendent. My personal professional practice goal. Glenn will lose 30 pounds by June 1st. All right? It is specific. We all know exactly what 30 pounds is. All right? It is attainable because I've done it about 12 times. All right, we know it can be done, all right? Measurable. We know specific, measurable, attainable. Relevant, because the doctor said you got to take 30 pounds off. And timely, because time is running out, you got to get it done by June. All right? So for an academic goal, and again, I'm making this up, you might say that the achievement, well, we're all dealing with learning loss. COVID ruined everybody's evaluation because none of the goals became irrelevant overnight. Sort of like when the fall of communism and the Berlin Wall came down and there was no more Soviet Union, and all the professors teaching Eastern European politics had to rewrite their syllabuses over like a 2-day period all of a sudden. Well, so let's say that theoretically you have a district where middle school math is a problem. And I say that because middle school math is a problem everywhere. So your student achievement goal would be the achievement gap for the different cohorts of middle school math will narrow by 3% over the next 12 months. Okay? Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. A SMART goal is not the students in the middle school who take math will feel good about themselves and feel better about themselves in June. That's not achievement, that's not specific, it's not measurable. I suppose there are mental health professionals who could say it is, but those aren't SMART goals. So you want to have goals that are clear, criteria in the evaluation that are relevant, and you start the year telling the superintendent, here's the evidence we will want to see at the end of the year, so you can say to us, here's how we know we have met our goals, or I have met my goals, or the district has met its goals. And then somewhere halfway through the year, you do an informal temperature taking, and you all sit around and say, how are we doing? Now, there are over 45 different criteria you can use to evaluate the superintendent. Pick 6 to 10 of them. Don't pick 45, because you're going to get nothing but a ton of paper thrown at you, and none of it's going to be particularly diligently written. So you pick a half a dozen, maybe 8, 10 goals that you think you can make, and then you sit down mid-year, and you might say to the superintendent, you know, we didn't pick enough of the right goals, we need to add a couple more. Or we picked too many, and it's not workable. And then you move on from there, and the members of the school committee will then give the superintendent an end-of-the-year score, which will be fed to an aggregator who collects all the information from everybody and puts together a proposed summary evaluation for the school committee to edit and approve. By the way, Glenn's Law number 3, group editing is a crime against humanity. Okay? So you try to get a working group that will maybe help the school committee figure it out. But when you get the aggregator's summary, the aggregator will say, and it could be any one of you. Now, I've had board secretaries threaten my life if I suggest the board secretary should be the aggregator, so I'm just saying it's a tough task, but there's that. So you create a written summary and you identify the ranking. The superintendent might be exemplary, might be proficient, might be needs improvement, and might be unsatisfactory. And from there, you finish the evaluation. A key element in this is whether or not your evaluation document and process need to be developed in consultation with the superintendent or mutually agreeable with the superintendent. Now, I tell this to every school committee that I meet with, especially those that are doing searches looking for superintendents. When you hire the superintendent, the first call the superintendent is going to make is to the Superintendent's Association, and they're going to get the model contract from the Superintendent's Association. That model contract should go in the trash. You should use our model contract, which is better. The superintendents would say you have to have it by mutual agreement. And that way, the superintendent gets a veto over any part of the evaluation that they want. There has to be an opportunity to push the button and say, well, we want this, you want that. If we can't reach this, we're going to make a determination, it's going to be this. But I don't know what your contract says, so you need to what is it? Mutually agreeable, okay, well, so,
What? I said that sounds like us.
okay. So at the beginning of the process, you need to sit down and mutually agree to the criteria that you'll use to evaluate the superintendent and the process. However, when your evaluations come back, that's 100% in school committee. And when it comes to deciding what the superintendent's rating should be, that is the school committee's decision by majority vote. And if you feel that your comments were left out of the aggregation, you can vote to amend the aggregated evaluation and change it. So the most egregious example occurred in one of our towns several years ago, where there was a member of the school committee who truly believed that Satan brought the superintendent to town, and nothing the superintendent could do was acceptable. Superintendent lacked the intelligence to add a column of sums. The superintendent lies, the superintendent cheats. Just everything bad about the superintendent was this person's belief. The other 6 members of the 7-member board were giving the superintendent a exemplary evaluation. So whenever any element of the evaluation would come up, the disgruntled member would say, I move to change the evaluation from exemplary to unsatisfactory, and on a 6-to-1 vote, every proposed change he made was shot down. But his evaluation is a public document, as are yours. So you have to be really careful, not that you're going to get sued, because you're not, but you have to be really careful. Anything you say becomes public. And depending upon where you are, there are superintendents who have said, when it comes to putting the budget together, I rely on the assistance of my professional staff who really know this stuff better than I do in terms of the math and the projections and all of that. So what does the local, tabloid say? Superintendent can't count money. In other words, you say something meaning one thing, and depending upon how aggressively those papers cover things, it's reported as something different. So we need to be pretty careful. And the other thing we need to be pretty careful of is, in this day and age, one slip up, one careless, poor choice of words can end your career, especially if you don't know the mic is hot. So you want to be really careful about what you say. But there are people who have delivered some pretty strong praise and some pretty sharp criticism about superintendents, and they do it knowing that even if they don't prevail on the evaluation, it's part of the record. And it's sort of like the vote of no confidence. A lot of our districts have had the bargaining units take vote of no confidence in the superintendent or the school committee or whoever it happens to be. Part of that strategy is because they want to put something on the record. And even though the vote of no confidence, sort of like getting kicked out of the Book of the Month Club, it really has no impact other than to say, we're giving you a vote of no confidence, and we want everybody to know forever that you got a vote of no confidence, even though your lack of confidence in us is because we're not giving you everything you want, and that's how it is. So there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of political stuff that's inherent in being an elected official. That may be a longer answer than you wanted, but it covers evaluation, so that, no.
Because I think one of the things, and right now we're in the process of coming up with our mutually agreed upon kind of criteria and goals.
certainly I've kind of gone through the process of having SMART goals, of understanding that there needs to be an actual number attached to things, that is a concrete measure that we can look at. So we have, and I'm comfortable that they don't all have to be like that, but that there should be within each, personally, within each kind of area of endeavor, at least one should be a numeric goal. So, and I think this is one of the things, Mr. Superintendent, that we had kind of put to the side until we had this meeting, because we wanted an opportunity to kind of discuss that. So, from my perspective, that's always been kind of my approach. So my question would be, from the language that's in the superintendent's contract, we can't mandate that. We're gonna be required that if the superintendent isn't comfortable having a numeric value attached to something, that we're not empowered to put it in
Well,
place.
No, let me be a little more clear. You can negotiate with the superintendent about how much each will weigh. But the scoring that you will give the superintendent on each of those criteria is for the school committee to determine. You would score them in one of the four ways that you would, the exemplary, proficient,
Right.
needs improvement, unsatisfactory. You don't have to negotiate what you give the superintendent as a score. You just have to use the structure as you created at the beginning. So if you pick a criteria that says, let's say something related to data and student achievement, so you could, whatever criteria, use of data and student achievement, you will have a goal there. You'll ask the superintendent to respond. And if you feel the superintendent has given you data that demonstrates success, then the superintendent gets a good rating. If the superintendent gives you data that says you haven't achieved the goal that you wanted, then maybe the rating is not so good.
So let me, just to get specific, so the one that you used as an example, middle school math. So the goal itself would be looking for, I think you said 3% of reduction in the,
Narrowing of
groups,
the
yeah.
achievement.
so, in my mind, that's a concrete measure, that the superintendent can provide us with absolute, a measurable thing. If none of our goals have that component to them, like, and again, I'm not trying to, I don't want to create goals that the superintendent
Yeah.
doesn't want, to be clear. Because I know he's really interested in his phone right now, but I guess he's probably listening to what I'm saying. Maybe I was wrong, maybe you weren't. But, I want us to be able to negotiate these things. But I do think that there comes a point where there needs to be a finite, again, I think it's reasonable, one per area with an actual number in it, an actual concrete measure. But my understanding from as we're having this conversation is that it needs to be mutually agreed upon, so I could go in circles
Well-
and never get there.
No. They're supposed to be SMART goals.
Right,
If you're not
that's-
smart, then you don't have a goal. What I say would be mutually agreeable is the category of the response. The process that you agree to will be, all right, one of the 10 criteria we're going to use is data. And how do we make that goal specific and measurable? We work it out right here. And if the response is, and again, I'm hypothesizing and making this up, if the response is, we're going to feel better about how we're doing, that's not smart. It's not a SMART goal. You don't have to accept it. What you do have to accept by mutual agreement are the categories that you select. And the goals that the superintendent establishes overall. And those need to be smart.
Okay, so the grid that we're looking at, I'm saying this for everyone's benefit, the grid that we've been working from, we need to return to and see and ensure that there are SMART goals.
Correct.
There are SMART measurements
Specific and measurable. Now,
built into those.
I would also say it's up to you to determine whether or not, after you've got the data and you've seen how things have gone, You can then also have figured out, sometimes the superintendent will say, there are certain special things that we need to recognize in this process, like we're coming back from COVID and learning loss, so please don't criticize me because we have learning loss. We're trying to correct that and go from here. You may also believe that the data say one thing, but other criteria say something else. And when you give your personal evaluation, you have the right to integrate all of the different sources of information that inform you. So you want to have that agreement made as well. Now, for example, if I'm the superintendent and and I'm supervising a principal, or if I'm the principal and I'm supervising a teacher, I can come in and watch you teach. I can evaluate the effectiveness of you in the classroom with those kids because I can walk in on you and observe anytime I want. You can't do that with the superintendent because a lot of what he does during the day, private, confidential meetings or whatever it is. But you do observe the superintendent at meetings, in the community. You receive written material from the superintendent, so you have a good sense of communication. You'll see the superintendent communicating with people, whatever, and you'll see documents and research or data that demonstrate how the kids are doing that help you get a sense of how everyone's doing. You can also ask questions like, have the principals evaluated all their teachers? We don't get to see the evaluations, but we do get to know, if this is a principal and that's a principal and they haven't evaluated their teachers this year as they were supposed to have done, and that actually happens sometimes.
We've heard.
Why did that happen? And if it didn't, maybe that is an indicator that we're observing about how you're not necessarily doing what you should do. Or, yes, you've done everything well. You're getting good feedback from the parents. You're getting good feedback from whoever talks to you. And just understand, this is America. You have the right to talk to anybody you want. But those are dangerous conversations sometimes, and you lose control of them the minute you stop talking. So I had a parent who came and complained to me that the kids, I was on the school committee in Cambridge, my kid's fourth grade teacher is terrible, the teacher doesn't know the curriculum, the teacher isn't good with the kids, the teacher's disrespectful of all the other parents, all the wrong things, but you have to refer that to the superintendent, and the superintendent might take care of it. That parent will give you feedback. Parents can talk to you about their own kids. The superintendent can't talk to you about another person's child. It's private. There are privacy rights all over this thing. So, again, if people want to talk to you, they have the right to speak to you. Just remember, they're dangerous conversations in many cases. You all know a lot of the teachers in the school district. You're going to bump into somebody at the supermarket, and you're going to talk about the best vegetables or whatever, best fruit of the fruit counter, whatever it happens to be. And that's fine, but if the conversation goes to, so how's it going with that new principal? I hear he's a real jerk, or I hear the new principal is great, how's it going? That's a dangerous conversation to lure a member of the faculty into, especially if your contract says you have to report all of the complaints brought to you to the superintendent. And if that's in your contract, you have something that's very, very difficult to work with and hard to enforce. If everybody that complains to you, you're required to give them up and report and say, Mr. Superintendent, the Smith family is telling me that their fourth grade teacher is terrible. They didn't want me to tell you, but I have to tell you because it's in your contract. Again, it becomes difficult. So the diplomacy around this is very awkward, and you got to be careful. Now, you had a hand going up. That's okay. Are you trying to keep your fingerprints from being taken?
Yes, I got cold all of a sudden. Thank you. I guess my question is, so if we don't understand a goal at this point, then we can work collaboratively with the superintendent to really identify
As a
more
body, yes.
closely, like what we're looking for and get more quantitatively
Correct.
what we're looking for, right?
Correct.
And that can go ongoing until we get to where we need to be.
Till you feel you have an instrument that's ready to go.
Okay, thank you.
But, you know, we had a situation in one of our towns, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, where they made a hire, and it was a very bad hire. And the school committee realized, we need to fix this. And the superintendent said, well, you can't fire me until you've evaluated me. And you can't evaluate me until we have a mutually agreeable evaluation tool. And I'm not agreeing to anything. So they had to buy 2.5 years of a superintendent's time to make this person go away. So the lesson is, as Carl Malden used to say in the American Express commercials, don't let this happen to you. I'm just saying, that's advice we give our school committees. But don't look for trouble where no trouble exists, because most of our relationships are very good and solid. And you don't want to be looking for a superintendent anytime soon, because not a lot of people want to be superintendents. I know, I'm just. Yes.
Just to remind the committee members, we're making this meeting a little bit less formal, and the presenters is in front of us, so feel free to ask the presenter and can call upon you. Just make the meeting and the presentation more fluid. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk about some specific areas that we've been, I think, wrestling with as a committee around governance versus management, because I certainly have my own idea about my role as a school committee person. And so I'm going to give you a specific example. We had a letter that was sent to the school committee from the Lowell Board of Health regarding a number of students that they had, the nurses, which the nurses work for the city, except for some special education nurses, but the nurses through the Board of Health had concerns that there were students in classes that hadn't had their immunizations verified. And that was counter to state law, school committee policy, everything, right? That letter didn't make it on the agenda. So I had one of the nurses reach out to me and say, did you see this letter? We copied the school committee. It's from the Lowell Board of Health. It wasn't on the agenda for the fall. So our meetings are posted Friday afternoon for a Wednesday meeting. And, you know, whatever's on the agenda is what we talk about. You know, we don't have to necessarily discuss every communication, but we get communications from, thank you for noting my parent died. You know, we get those kind of communications, they're on the agenda. This, I felt, was a very important communication. It took a great deal of effort, multiple phone calls to the mayor and the superintendent to get it on the agenda. And I think that when we did finally have it and we discussed it, the nurses were not available that night to speak about it because they hadn't seen it on the agenda, so you can't talk about it unless it's on the agenda, right? And the issue, when it was discussed on the floor, and the superintendent's here, so if he has a different recollection of it, but one of the points of the discussion was that crossed over from governance to management, or administration, whatever word you want to use. And in my mind, that is very much a part of our role as the government body, that if we have policies, and to make sure those policies are in fact happening in our classrooms and across the district as fairly as possible, we need to question. That was really what it was about for me, the questioning. So two things, if you could address, the role of the agenda and the role of the school committee on the agenda, and communications to the school committee, and actually the third one, where was that crossover? Is that a gray area when you've got the Board of Health saying, you know, we're concerned about kids in the classroom? So if you could address those three areas within this specific, and then I'm open to if Dr. Boyd had other thoughts. But this is how it, from my perspective, was it played out.
We were doing a parliamentary procedures training. I would have opened it by giving you the basic etched-in-stone rules of parliamentary procedure. Number one, the chair is the servant of the body, not the master. Number two, the agenda is the property of the body. The body, the school committee. So you get to decide who puts the agenda together. It's frequently delegated to the superintendent's office or the secretary to the board, whoever it might be, whoever it is. And if someone wants to put an item on the agenda, you should have a rule for how something goes on the agenda. So if a majority of you want something on the agenda for the next meeting, it goes on the agenda for the next meeting. I'm just saying that that's the rule. The majority rules, and the agenda is your property. Now, if a communication comes to the district, you have a protocol for, I mean, if the communication came on Monday and your meeting is Tuesday, that's, yeah. If the communication came a week and a half ago and the meeting is Tuesday, that's different. The question here is, was the communication addressed to the school committee and not to the school district? If it was addressed to the school committee would see the communication because it's a public communication to an elected body. But if the communication seeks action of the district, the matter of maintaining the public health within the district would be for the superintendent and the superintendent's staff to see that the problems identified are resolved. That's not for the school committee to, the school committee doesn't do the day-to-day stuff. But that's not to say that if adherence to your policy is part of the issue, you should be briefed on what's being done about it. In other words, you would ask the superintendent, we've got this letter from the Board of Health, can you give us an update on what's happening to make sure that our policies are covered? So when a situation like that comes up, we usually are cautious in giving advice because I haven't seen anything about this. This is not something I know anything about with regard to Lowell. But if the communication is, if anyone sends a communication to the school committee, it generally goes on the agenda for communications. There will be people who will write to you and bring problems to your attention that you don't have the authority to resolve yourselves. That's why you have the administration. So you get to see the communication, and you can ask the superintendent to report to you on, is our policy being followed, and what are we doing to make sure our policy is being followed? Who the kids are who aren't vaccinated or being cared for or whatever is a privacy thing. So the answer to your questions are, it depends, but the communication that comes to you should go on the agenda, if there's time to get it on the agenda.
I think this one actually brings up a broader that tends to be the challenge. So I've got to manage the policies of the district. So by our policies, I believe, and I'll have to pull it through. So I'm the secretary of the school board by their vote at each inauguration, each reorganization session. So the design of the agenda, and that's done in collaboration with the chair, who happens to be the mayor. I believe our policies, and I don't happen to have this one in front of me, does stipulate, much like you said, the mayor himself or the committee as a body can add an item to an agenda. There is not an opportunity for any community group just to put something on an agenda. So in this particular case, there was a question about the management of the schools by principals. So there wasn't action even allowable by the committee. It was a question about the management of principals that needed to be investigated by me before it would even be something that could even be discussed. So the committee received all of the communication both ways, as well as the communication about how things move onto the agenda, how do people get invited to the meetings. I believe this was a couple of memos back to the committee. But I think the broader challenge, which I would like to surface, is when I have to tell an individual committee member no, and unfortunately I have to do that from time to time. It's even been the case where the mayor and I will have a conversation and we have disagreement on two things and we'll have to have a discussion about it. I have to follow the will of the body as a whole, and absent the will of the body as a whole, I have to follow the policies that are on the books. So I cannot, and I love all of you, all individually. I enjoy working with all of you, but I can't show preferential treatment to any one of you, and that also includes the mayor. So what it is it's the policies that are on the books that I have to follow, and at times we have divided votes. We have division amongst the body. We'll have disagreements. So the overriding decision then are the rules. And oftentimes I find when I cite the rule because there's disagreement, that leads to friction. So we have 3 sets of rules that often have to be followed. The one set is state law that Mr. Kuchar referenced multiple times. The second are our policies, which he's referenced. He won't be as familiar with our individual policies. And the third is my contract. And it's not, when I suggest that I'm following that, it's not to take a hard line or to be inflexible. It's to say that we have to operate by a set of rules, because it's very, very difficult for me to work for 7 bosses. All of you have individual minds, all of you have individual decisions, and when there is an item of substance, we seldom have consensus. We have consensus around items that are of limited substance, but when there's something rather substantive as a body, the feedback I get individually is not of consensus. So I then have to provide advice and guidance back, and those are usually the areas. So this body does authorize the mayor as the chair with a significant amount of authority to work with the superintendent. And outside of that, there are certain exceptions where if there's 2 of you, and as 2, you can act, and then as the 2, that goes then through the mayor. So oftentimes the way we operationalize this, and this is just our practice, is you work through the mayor, because then you as an individual along with the mayor, that's then 2, and the mayor will then give me a call and say, here's what we need to do to make an addition or an adjustment to the agenda. So nothing, I don't think any individual circumstance is easy to work through in terms of kind of unpacking a case. For me, it tends to be that circumstance overall. In any case where I have to say no, and I have to tell you, it's never comfortable to tell your boss no. No matter how much education and training we have, no matter how much experience we have, to tell any of you no is never comfortable. It's just my obligation based on, the laws, the policies, and the rules that we operate under. And that, I find, does tend to lead to some tension and to some follow-up.
Let me go to 2 points here. With regard to what the district will do about the public health issues, the board, as a body, can ask the superintendent to report back on what's being done to resolve the public health issue. That's clear. The issue of whether something goes on the agenda because it's a communication, that's also clear. If there's a communication that goes to the school committee from wherever it comes from, it goes to the school committee, even if there's not an area of responsibility for you. Your constituents, as I said, have an unrestricted right to communicate with you, and there are no roadblocks put in that, only the ones you set yourselves. However, unrelated to that, my colleagues, when we meet school board associations around the country, we meet once a year with the superintendents too. And they have asked us to deal with a particular issue. And this came home to me. You mentioned when Bob Peterkin was the superintendent in Cambridge, we had a member of our school committee, the infamous person who spoke for 45 minutes to an empty room. All right? every meeting, there would be a different whim of the minute motion. So, oh, we need a motion to add another coach, we need a motion to do this, a motion to do that, but it's wasting a lot of time. So what we do is, we'd refer them all to the superintendent. Thank you, refer to the superintendent without objection. And Bob Peterkin took me aside and said, I have 75 issues waiting for me to report back to you. Who do you think writes these reports? Right? I don't have a big staff that just sits around and writes reports. So please, superintendents across the country have pleaded with us to tell school committee members, don't send something to me just to make it go away. Just tell your colleagues, no. And it's called vanity time, and it's mentioned in here. How much, but I don't, yours, that's not a vanity issue, the one that you're raising. It's an issue of public health, and it's important. And maybe there was some communications circuits not quite connecting on that. But again, if somebody sends you a communication, it should go to the school committee, and you should see it. But how it's resolved may take longer for you to find out than just calling the superintendent and say, you know, as I once did, saying, I want to know who's making overtime among the custodians. I understand that certain favored custodians are getting more overtime than others, and they're complaining to me. And our superintendent at the time said, you know, really, this is not how I should be spending my time, helping you get some disgruntled custodian more overtime. That's not what this is about. So it was a good lesson, and Bob Peterkin gave me a good lesson about what's important. So, again, a little longer to explain, but
So to boil it down though, as I'm understanding it, if something is sent to the body, if something is sent to the body, that becomes a public document and needs to be put into correspondence
it's a
on the.
public document ipso facto. But if it's
So
sent
me
to the
saying-
school- sent to the school committee, it should be sent to the school committee.
Should be on there.
So it should be on the agenda, that's what
Should
I'm,
be on the agenda, yeah. You can give the superintendent directions about how to handle that, but it's a communication to the body.
So you're saying that we, as a school committee, should have, sorry.
Mike,
So you're saying we, as the school committee, should have put it on the agenda instead of waiting for the superintendent to put it on the
I
agenda?
don't know what the timing was. How
Okay.
the letter came.
No, but I'm just saying because it was sent to us.
Yes.
So we could have taken the initiative to actually get it put on the agenda.
If you knew the communication was coming,
Okay.
and you didn't see it on the agenda, you could say, it needs to be on the agenda.
Okay.
For the upcoming meeting, if you have 48 hours advance
Okay.
notice, or for the following meeting, if you don't.
but by the same token, if we don't know this is coming,
You should have a policy that says communication to the school committee should be an agenda, should
there
be
you go.
on our agenda.
That it should automatically be put
Yes,
in
frankly,
correspondence so we receive
I'm
it
not
that way.
aware of a situation where that is not the case,
Okay.
if I can use a double negative here.
well, we do have a communication item on the agenda for that. And the reason I'm bringing that up again, I mean, we have Mr. Kuchar here to also advise us, but I'm aware of 2 other communications that have come to the school committee in the last week or so, and I want to make sure that they're on the agenda.
Just make sure they were
Under
sent to the
communication.
school committee,
Well, they were copied to the school
copied to the
committee.
school committee, then they should, then the school committee.
And I'm talking about the letter from the retiring city solicitor, and there was a resignation letter from Dr. Palachea. Those are 2 that were copied to us that I need to see on the agenda. And it's not me personally asking where you have to say no, it's a policy that communications to the school committee
Yeah.
goes to on the agenda.
I would say there is an exception if there's a matter of privacy. In other words, if someone sends a letter to the school committee and
Tagging
says,
somebody.
person X has done this to my child, and the principal did nothing about it, and I want it addressed, that's a different format, because there's privacy involved. But generally,
So I want to make sure that, I believe the 2 you're referencing are with our labor attorney. So there are separate rules and guidelines. I'm not aware of the second. The first one is with the labor attorney. I'm not aware of the second, but I would. You mentioned communication from the former solicitor. That's actually with the labor attorney working with the current solicitor. So that's a different conversation.
If there's collective bargaining involved in any of this, whole different set of rules.
Yeah, no, that's not, that's.
No, it's not collective
Okay, it's
bargaining.
okay, if they,
Yeah. So I'd,
or anything that's private.
So to ask though, because this is a fine point, so if we're being told that it's with the labor attorney, I mean, does that mean we don't get it?
Right.
That it doesn't go?
If it's a confidential matter,
It's not.
it might.
It's not,
It's a recommendation, you know, of,
Oh, if someone just wants to,
not someone,
Dispense
the
with-
former city
If so-
solicitor.
if a citizen wants to give you some ideas about how to do your job,
yes.
that is a matter of public record.
Right. And I would say that as a former city solicitor, I'm sure that Ms. O'Connor understood the rules of confidentiality and all that. That she wrote it to the school committee intending it to be a public document.
I would caution and reserve your right for executive session to discuss labor matters and matters of executive privilege. So I would suggest that. I would also say that it does bring open another opportunity for how we can start to bridge the gap of governance management. There are times where I come to public sessions and I am surprised by the information shared, meaning that the committee has information that has not made its way to any staff member, and we're surprised. I don't know that that's the right type of context or environment we want to establish as a team. Now, when we end up with tension here, again, it goes back to the first thing that I said, because often when we come into this, I will cite one of the rules. And it was actually one of the rules that Mr. Kutcher said he perhaps doesn't recommend, but it is within my contract that every concern and complaint that is shared with the committee needs to be shared with me. And there is a reason for that, is to avoid these types of surprises, because it's difficult for me to advise you as to whether something is public, something is executive, whether there is risk. The committee itself, as individuals and as a body, may not have the entirety of context. There may be some context behind it. There was conversations that we've had in public where there's references to stuff where, as committee members, you weren't necessarily aware that you were referencing something that was a legal matter, but it was within the law department working through it. So these rules are here to protect you as committee members, to enable me to do my job as superintendent on your behalf, and to be able to serve the community. So I do think the more often that we can avoid surprises, and there have been times where there have been things that have been suggested and shared where we've then convened with staff and no staff members had heard about any of it.
Is this one of those cases?
I don't, so one of the cases, there is one that's with the attorney that, again, I'm going to reserve the right for the committee for executive discussion, and I would caution the committee and make sure that you're reserving that right. It is with the two attorneys, and both the labor attorney and the solicitor have discussed this. And I would leave that conversation there. I would say as well, though, have the conversation with me, bring it to my attention, and we can have that conversation. And I would urge, please don't take any type of offense at me having to say that we have to follow this rule. The intent here is to serve the community. The intent's to serve you well as a committee. And in order to do that, sometimes we do have to follow the rules that might not be what the committee at that moment wants to follow. You do also have rights as a committee so that you can convene an executive session to have discussions that may be at a legal risk, but is within the purview of the committee. And that's why it gets referred to the attorney. So that I would leave that one there. But I think the broader is to know just call, discuss, have a conversation.
If I just want to ask a question about that, because I think that has been another area of tension. When the superintendent refers to calling or discussing, he's talking about one-on-one conversations with the committee, where I've always really tried hard to follow what can be discussed in open meeting should be discussed in open meeting, that we learn from hearing each other's questions and concerns. So I prefer, and I have expressed, I think, all my concerns. I mean, I'm probably like the queen of that, in meetings, and not crossing the line and not going into privacy or, names of people, trying not to. I'm not going to claim that I never have. So so maybe you could address, like, what is the best way? Aren't we supposed to work as a body in public?
Couple of things. When we work with superintendents in workshops about dealing with school committees, one thing that we're very careful to point out is the no surprises rule goes both ways. Now, you may have, those of you who've come to orientation, there are some things that we carry around with us, like a copy of the Constitution, and two things I've never found in the Constitution that I've always looked for, and that is the part that says the bride's father pays for the whole wedding, and the no surprises clause. It's not in the Constitution, okay? But it works both ways. If you're aware of something, being a successful school committee member is a lot about not what you can do or what you may do, but what you should do. So if you are aware of something that's important and, don't drop it as a surprise in the middle of a school committee meeting and say, oh, by the way, what are you doing about the morale problem up at the Smith School? I hear that it's terrible there. Or you just dropped a bomb in the middle of a meeting and he doesn't know about it because maybe there isn't a morale problem. Whoever's feeding you information is giving you bad information. Surprising anybody at a school committee meeting is not helpful. The same way, you don't want to find out that you're about to address an issue of policy and the other members have been spoken to individually, but not collectively, and a decision has been sort of made, and the superintendent's not covered by the open meeting law. That only covers elected officials in this case. So, my best example was when we approved our desegregation plan. It was dumped on our lap, and we were told, you got to approve this, or else you're going to cost us $7 million in federal money. And it was the whole plan, and none of us had spoken about it as a group. Superintendent's staff person had spoken to people individually, decided what our consensus was, and then dumped it on us before we had time to debate it. That's one of the reasons why that guy never worked again as a superintendent. So you don't, and we tell superintendents about, please make sure that your school committee's ability to make choices are not compromised by the fact that you've worked out an arrangement with a majority and the deal is already going through. So this is advice we give to everybody. It's not Lowell specific, nothing to do with Lowell, but I'm just saying, you want the school committee to know what everybody else knows at the same time, unless it's just not possible to do that.
I just feel like this is just really good school committee therapy right now because I've definitely made the mistake this past year. And I bottled things up and I let it go, and I realized we had a conversation and we talked, and I got much better at just everything I heard. Like, I just would let the superintendent know. But I got to that point that I let things bottle up inside of me, and I just released it in a school committee meeting, and it just wasn't professional and it wasn't good. And it's a learning process, I think, on our parts, because it's a learning curve, and these are things, I went to the orientation for Mass School Committee meeting, and I don't remember everything because there's a lot of information thrown at you, over that weekend, and there's so much you walk away with, and so there are things that you walk away with, and there are things that you're like, okay, I want to make a point here, So, but there is that mutual respect that you just need to just essentially have.
You
in the
should
basic.
follow those protocols.
Right,
There's no law that says you have to. But,
right.
you also have the right to make a fool out of yourself. You have the right to insult your colleagues at a school committee meeting. It's not a good way to do business, but You have the right to make the wrong decision. A judge is never going to overrule you just because you didn't do what was best, as long as what you did was legal. So don't worry about it. Another 4 or 5 terms on the committee, you'll have this all figured out. Yes?
I'm just curious, what is the line, because I know personnel matters are not in our purview, but I'm really just, what is the line when a personnel matter impacts a student? So for example, let's say that a teacher does something inappropriate with a student. Where does the delineation become?
That line of privacy rights apply to the teacher and to the student. So the superintendent may not be able to discuss with you who the teacher is, or who the student is, or what the issues are. Now, if the student's parents go out and have a press conference on the front stairs of City Hall, no, you can foolishly give up your child's privacy rights by bringing your child to a budget hearing and say, oh, here's my child, little Terry. Terry has the following, diagnosis and medical problems, and you've just made a public figure out of little Terry. Privacy rights out the window. So don't make it worse. The chair has to protect the committee from itself by making sure that people's privacy rights are not violated during the meeting. Sometimes the chair has to say, don't answer that question. Before you keep talking, remember you're violating your own kid's privacy rights. We've had some interesting issues around the role of the chair. You have public comment period?
Yep.
Because under the Natick decision, if someone comes to the microphone to speak and you think they're going to say something that's inappropriate, you can't stop them until they do. In other words, you can't stop somebody from speaking because you think you're not going to like what they're going to say. So be really careful about that. The other thing is the chair does have the right to remove a disruptive person from the room. So if someone refuses to relinquish the mic, or if someone abuses the mic by, issuing inappropriate attacks or comments, you can deal with that. But the big mistake that they made in Natick was that they stopped people from speaking before they spoke, because previously the offenders had grossly offended public policy with what they said, and they assumed that those people would be back doing the same thing again, and they tried to stop them.
So no one can be banned? So no one can be banned?
No, you can't ban somebody from a public meeting, but you can take the mic away if they have become disruptive, if they won't surrender the mic after their 3 minutes, if they are, just because they're saying something you don't want to hear doesn't mean you can take that away. But if it's a legitimate disruption,
But we don't have a general public comment portion of our agenda. I mean, for
don't.
people to be able to speak, you have to speak on something that is on the agenda.
Okay.
So people can't just wander in and start.
We do have that on the council side, which is interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And good luck with that.
There's, if I could, this might actually be helpful. I actually just located this, and Mr. Kutcher, this pamphlet's very helpful, so thank you for sharing that. If this came from, I'm assuming this came from MAC. So page 16, you can go down to legal counsel, and you can see where there is a separation of the majority of time at the school committee as the client. There are certain circumstances where myself or our special education director become the client, and Mr. Kutcher kind of laid that out in short summary term. We typically rely on counsel to help expand upon that, and when we refer to counsel, these are the types of nuances that they're working through. So we do have Dr. Hall here with us, that is our labor attorney, so those are the types of nuances that he's working through within each of these that he has to work through. So if he does ultimately determine that it's something that warrants executive session discussion, then that would be the appropriate place for it. But I appreciate that. I didn't get a chance to get through all of this, but I'm imagining there's a lot of these nuanced nuggets. That I will tell you is also an area of continuous challenge for every superintendent across every state, this notion of who's the client when, because there is this separation of duties and authorities by law, and trying to navigate that when now you're bringing in a third party, which is an attorney, to try to navigate that is also part of the challenges. But So that's 16 within that second section under legal counsel. And I think Mr. Kuchar was suggesting, how we can versus how we should. And I think for me, one thing that I think it's important to share with the committee, and I'm going to try to be respectful of the individual, but amongst our students are watching, our children are watching. One young person that I spoke to this summer, and I was celebrating the young person, highly involved, highly engaged, young person going on to one of this nation's most selective institutions based on the education received here in Lowell, and very aware of our entire environment. Brought the youngster aside and said how proud I was of him, how far beyond me he was at this point in his age, in his development. Suggested to him, at some point, you too might be running a school district. Without hesitation, he looked at me and said, I've watched the way our elected officials behave, and I would never subject myself to that type of environment. That's the young person's observation. That's how this young person was observing, reflecting, and ultimately, and I think sadly, concluding about how the interactions go. And I will tell you, I don't think that's the result of any one intent. I also don't think this committee has changed multiple times, so I don't know what iteration of the committee. I just bring that to say to me, that's a powerful testimony of the impact on the individuals that are watching as we try to work our way through this. So it is of benefit to have as many conversations as we can, communicate as often, because it ultimately comes down to teamwork. And being a team requires that collaboration. And, I really do subscribe to the no surprises. I try my very best to make sure that there are no surprises. And I think that helps all of us when we have those conversations so that we can make sure we avoid those observations that the student made.
With regard to the who says what and how people act, kids are seeing bad examples coming from Washington. They're seeing bad examples which have come from various sources in Washington. I do want to point out that according to the Gallup poll, school board members are the most trusted elected officials in the United States of America. Now that's because you're the closest to your constituents. You're the closest to your constituents. They can reach out and touch you whenever they want, and they put you in your seats. So there is a reason for that. The other thing that people who criticize local officials don't always realize is, and you all will understand this, it takes guts to put your name on a ballot, especially in a contested race, because you can win. After 8 or 10 times, maybe it's not as exciting as it was the first time, but you can win. You can win, and it feels good. But if you lose, everybody in the community knows the voters have fired you. So elected officials at the local level, you're all on TV, very sensitive about how they're portrayed, very sensitive about how people deal with them. So it's very hard, especially since a school committee member can vote on every budget line item, every policy. And nobody out there understands roles and responsibilities of school committees. I mean, don't your constituents come to you and say, here's my kid's problem, fix this for me, please? I voted for you. They lie. I voted. So being I forget who it was, and I think it was Richard Lugar, who was a United States Senator and was involved in the Foreign Relations Committee trying to deal with a crisis, and someone said, you sure you can handle this? And he said, if I could handle the Indianapolis School Board, I can handle this. So school boards are as tough as it gets. You take your work home with you every day. People bother you. Excuse me, they don't bother you. People might reach out to you every day. This requires a lot of time and energy, and You go to the polls and ask people to sustain you, and that's tough. So I compliment you on continuing to try to do your best, and ask you to think also about what should you do rather than what must you do or what can you do. And think of the implications of what it is. And call us at any time if you have any questions. And if there's anything specific and you want to kick it around and you want to Zoom or you want to do this again, please call us.
I think, Mr. Kuchar, I think the members have asked really good questions and made some good comments. And this booklet here, I'm just scanning through them, is a wealth of knowledge and very concise, very succinct. And you travel up here all the way from Cambridge to make the presentation to us on a rainy night as well. And thank you for answering all the questions. But I know that we didn't have time, you didn't have time to cover all the points in here. If you were to emphasize on 1 or 2 points from this booklet, what would that be? What would you want to leave with us tonight that to focus on?
It would largely be the most frequent issue that we have, how you deal with complaints that come to you, and how you refer them to the appropriate place, and what's the appropriate way for getting feedback on how those complaints are being addressed. And to act as a board over the important issues to make sure you get what's coming. The other, as they say, sometimes we have to remind the chair that the chair is the servant of the body, the city council and the school committee, and the chair's job is to make sure that the people who are not here are being represented just as well as the people who are here, and to protect people from themselves, because people at public comment period make a lot of mistakes, and unfortunately, you're the referee.
Well, I have enjoyed
I mean,
serving as a servant, so.
Unfortunately, the chair has a great responsibility there, and I'm sure.
Doing an excellent job, by the way.
Any other comments or questions from anyone?
I just had one quick question about the social media part. When you, and it said like if you have a blog or whatever else, if you are no longer a public official, but you started it as a public official, is it cut off because you're no longer?
No, you can keep blogging all you like. In fact, there's a growing body of law about, well, when a blogger becomes a journalist, and is it freedom of the press? I would just personally be careful that you don't libel or slander anybody inappropriately. But you can, we've got people who blog all over the place. I will say social media has replaced gin as the fastest way to make more mistakes and do more damage faster. I have to explain it. I've had an AOL account for like 25 years because it's free. And I can have 7 email names. And we have Comcast as our cable provider. I get another 6 names, right? So that's 13 names. And I have 2 brothers. So that's 39 names. I can create 39 names and create the appearance of a movement from my living room. So sometimes stuff goes out on social media. We during the when we had our resolutions out there, dealing with amnesty for LGBTQ children and families who, want to be able to find amnesty in a community. We had the same 6 people bombarding us every day with emails. Same message, whatever it was. Bring it to our delegate assembly. You'd think that it's going to be controversial. And it passes 97-6. The community was not spending all day blogging on social media trying to sway public opinions. So the issue with social media, we've also found out that 4% of our members access social media on a regular basis to get their information. So it's not
4%? of your
4%.
school committee members of the MASC?
4% of them use social media on a regular basis to get information around general issues. More people read our bulletins, our our bulletins and our emails as opposed to blogs and,
Okay,
And
your
other things.
information, okay.
so, yeah, blog away, it's free speech. Just be careful that, you know. Well, you can say anything about her, she's a public figure. But your neighbor may not appreciate, you know. Now,
Motion?
Second.
Before anyone
Second.
says anything about me.
Yeah. Stacy, no, that was, Ms. Doherty. Jackie, you second that? Was it
Yes,
Jackie?
Eileen made a motion.
Motion's passed.